So in this video I'm going to talk about crocheting with half double crochet, which is a UK half treble, and crocheting in the round in particular. So I'm going to go over a few things about this stitch and give you a few tips. So first of all, I'm just going to go over the actual basic construction of the stitch. So we're going to yarn over, we're going to go into the next stitch, we're going to pull up a loop, and you've got 3, then you're going to yarn over and draw off all 3. So that's a half double or UK half treble. So this is a handy stitch because it's still a relatively tall stitch, so you can create fabric relatively quickly, but it doesn't have as much space between the posts as a double crochet. So with a half double, which is a UK half treble, you get the best of both worlds. You get a longish stitch that works up quickly and has reasonably good drape, but you also don't have such a big gap between the posts. So in this instance I'm using it to make this sweater, and this is actually my latest design for Journals of Scottish Yarn, and I am using this Shetland double knit called Langzoon by Donna Smith Designs. It's a really fantastic natural Shetland wool. As you know, I'm an advocate for natural fibres, in particular Scottish natural fibres. So this starts off quite crisp and it is quite a rustic yarn, but once you've washed it and worn it a few times, it softens up and it ends up with a wonderful bloom, and it has great structure for sweaters like this that are quite sort of structured. So one thing I always do when I'm working sweaters in the round is that I always switch. Even though I'm working in the round, I will still work right side, wrong side, right side, wrong side, and this is to avoid the seam from slanting. So a slanting seam in crochet, where you always crochet every single round on the same side, i.e. the right side, ends up with the seam slanting usually towards the right as you progress. But with clothing that is really undesirable, because you end up with the seam travelling all around the side of the sweater and then also to the front or the back, depending on whether you're working top down or bottom up. So with this method we keep the seam in a very straight line, stacked on top of itself, and also we avoid a lot of the holes that you can get at the seam. So this is I mean, it's not a perfect seam, you can definitely see that the seam is there, but this is under the sleeve, there's no holes, and to me that is a very acceptable level of visibility for a crocheted seam. So one of the first things we are going to talk about is the anatomy of a half double crochet. So the unusual thing about a half double is actually how the top of the stitch falls in relation to the post. So this is the live loop. Obviously that is not counting as anything at the moment, because that is actually the very first step of the next stitch, and the post of the half double is here. But if you follow up the post and then look where the front and the back loop of that stitch are, which is there, it actually falls very far to the right. So it goes up and to the right. So at the best of times, when even if you're working on the right side only, it can be quite tricky to decipher which stitch does this belong to. So in terms of working it from this way, i.e. this front loop and back loop, what stitch does it belong to, which post, you go along to the left and then down. And if you're working the other way, so you're going from the post and you want to work out, well, this post, or let's pick another one, this post, where is the front and back loop that matches this stitch? So you go up and to the right. So that front loop back loop matches that post. So you can see how it can be easily confusing when people are trying to crochet with half double if you're not familiar with reading the stitches. So when you're making clothing in particular, you do really need to know, be able to read the stitches confidently, otherwise your seams and stitch counts and placement of stitch patterns and such are always going to be wrong if you haven't got it right. So for example, with this very bold cable design down the middle of this sweater, if you can't read the stitches properly and you're accidentally starting the cable or ending the cables in the wrong places, you're going to get a wonky design down the front of the sweater. Anyway, so that's that stitch and the anatomy of a half double. Slightly unusual, as I said, top of the stitch falls quite far to the right from the actual post. And then the next thing that people find a little bit tricky is when you're working into the wrong side of this stitch. So as I said, when I'm working in the round, I always work right side and then wrong side. So this row here is currently on the right side, and the previous row I did was worked on the wrong side. So as you can see, a very common thing that I've noticed people doing, especially with my students, is that they pick up this part and this part of the half double thinking that those are the front and back loops, but actually they're not. That's actually the back ridge of the stitch there. If we roll it over very slightly towards us, you can see the front loop and back loop of the stitch are actually there. It's not that and that. Okay, so always remember with these half doubles, the front and back loop actually lie pretty flat to the front of the work. So when you turn the work to the wrong side, they're really tilted quite far back. So you just need to tilt the work forward when you're working on the wrong side. So the next thing is starts and ends of rounds. So I'm just going to whiz to the start of this round, and then I'll go over starting and ending in the round with this half double crochet stitch. So I'm coming to the end of this round and I'm working into each stitch. So this is a kind of a chicken and egg thing, because I've got to, I can't explain the start without finishing off a round, and I can't finish off the end of the round without starting, because obviously I've picked up stitches from the yoke here, so I haven't actually started with a starting chain or anything as such, so I can't show you that part. So the last stitch is actually here for me, and I'll explain why in a minute. So I go into that with a half double, and now I need to identify the first stitch of the round. So whenever I'm working half doubles, I always start with a chain 2, which I never count as a stitch, and nor do I ever work into it. So this little chain at the beginning here, I'm just going to completely ignore. I'm going to find the first half double I did, which is here. So I'm just identifying the post. I'm not actually going to crochet around that, I'm just doing that so you can see. That's my first half double. So using the method of reading these stitches, I'm travelling up, and then this one is actually more or less on top, just because of the way it's been formed straight after the chain. That is the top of that. Actually, once I put the hook in, you can see how far to the right that is. But that is the top of that very first stitch. So on top of that very first stitch, I'm going to slip stitch. So I'm just going to grab the yarn that I've grabbed. I'm going to carry on and put it through the live loop on the hook. Now, the problem with this is that slip stitch, can you see how that slip stitch I've just made looks very much like a stitch? So this is where people often end up in trouble, because every time they do this slip stitch and they work back the other way, or they now turn around and carry on back the way they've just come, they inadvertently work into the slip stitch and increase by 1 stitch. So you might be having that problem if you're always finding you've got 1 stitch too many. So the way round this that I like to do is literally to try and make that slip stitch disappear, and I do that by tightening it up. And the way I do that is by putting my finger on the live loop to secure it, my index finger, and then I'm going to pull up and away, keep pulling, keep pulling, keep pulling. So it doesn't matter if that live loop gets longer, but can you see how that slip stitch has shrunk to almost nothing? And then you can readjust the live loop. So it just makes it less likely for you to inadvertently work into that. But the other benefit of that is it really tightens up the start of that round. So let's now do the next round. So this round that I have literally just worked was the right side. So I'm going to chain 2. And if you remember a minute ago, I said that I chain 2, but that doesn't count as a stitch, and nor do I ever work into it. It is basically literally just a turning chain. So I chain 2, and then I turn the work to the other side, which in this case is the wrong side, or the inside of this sleeve. And then, being very careful to avoid that slip stitch that I've made right at the beginning there, I'm going to start putting one stitch into each of the next stitch of the previous round, remembering not to try and crochet dead on from this side and picking up those which are not the correct part of the stitch, but to roll the work so that you can see front loop, back loop. Okay, so that's the other thing as well, is for stitch consistency you need to make sure you've got a free flow of yarn here, because I'm trying to be clever on this one. I'm trying to knit parts of the sleeve and the body at the same time, because I'm in the design process for this at the moment, and I've got 2 balls of wool on the go, and they keep tangling up with each other. Not a good idea. You can end up with really inconsistent tension, well, more like inconsistent stitch heights. If the yarn isn't free flowing, you could end up with some stumpy stitches. See how that stitch is slightly shorter, where I pulled the yarn and accidentally shortened the stitch where the yarn wasn't free flowing. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead now and crochet all the way around, and I will see you back in a minute when I'm ready to finish off this round. Just coming back to the start of the round, so you need to pay attention to what's going on here. So I've definitely got one more stitch there, and then another spot where people get confused is where this chain 2 came out. So if you remember, you made, if we turn it back to the other side, this is the last stitch of the last round that you did. If you remember, you did a slip stitch into the top of the first half double, which is this one here. So that is a stitch that needs to be worked into. So this stitch that appears to sort of have the chain 2 coming out of it, you need to work into that stitch. That is your last stitch. So if you're unsure and you're not sure whether you've got another stitch to work or not, the best thing to do, and I know people really hate it when I say this, you must count your stitches. If you're 1 stitch short, let's just say I'm 1 stitch short and I'm wondering whether this is a stitch to be worked into or not, if I count I've only got 49, then that just confirms that yes, I must work into that stitch. So I know I keep saying this, I've taught for more than 10 years in-person crochet classes, and for some people, for some reason, people have a real aversion to actually counting their stitches. Unfortunately, unless you want to just do free form, or you're not bothered about whether sleeves are one big one, one small one, you do have to learn to count stitches, or at least get into the habit of counting stitches. Anyway, so I have now put all the required stitches into this round of this sleeve, and now I need to find the first stitch that I made. So remember, we did this chain 2, which I'm ignoring, then I did this half double here, so I follow it up, and front loop, back loop that's slightly to the right of it. That is the stitch that I need to slip stitch into. So again, slip stitch is just pulling up a loop, and that loop you've pulled up carries on through the loop on the hook, and then I'm going to pinch my index finger onto that live loop and pull it until that slip stitch shrinks to nothing, and then readjust my live loop. And then I do the same process again. I do yarn, chain 2, Turn the work this time to the right side, and the whole sweater's got to come with me. Oops. And then being very careful to skip that very first slip stitch I made, which you will struggle to get into anyway because you've tightened it up. You're then going to work back round the other way, 1 in each. So that's it basically. It's not very difficult. You just have to know what you're doing. You have to know how to read the half doubles, and you just need to be careful not to work into your slip stitch join. Count your stitches, and that will help you get a really nice neat seam when working half double crochet in the round. So I hope you found that useful. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in this sweater. It's going to be in issue 6 of the Journal of Scottish Yarns. Journal of Scottish Yarn will have exclusivity for a whole year. I think this will be coming out in November 2024. I can't really show you. It's got a funnel neck. I can't really show you the whole thing. Raglan sleeved, so what it's called a sort of soft raglan. When it's published, I'll give you a much better photo of it so you can get a better idea. But anyway, if you end up making that sweater, or any sweater really, the way you're using half double in round, hopefully this video would have been useful for you.